Well, it's a privilege today to be here with Thom Rainer. Thom helps lead the efforts of Lifeway and also an author at the same time. And today, in particular, we're going to be talking about his recent book, The Autopsy of a Deceased Church. Thom, welcome.
Thanks, Tony. And we were having a conversation earlier before the video started, and I just got to give a shout out. You have not told me to. This is my own doing. I got to give a shout out for your ministry, your blog, and all that you're doing that's through that. We're kindred spirit, and the way you love churches is just heartwarming to me, and I got to thank you for your ministry. I know you're interviewing me, but I had to say that.
Well, thank you, Thom. That's kind of you. Well, let's just dive right into the book. First of all, I'm curious, what prompted you to write it?
Well, it started off like many things that you do. It started off as a short blog post. The blog post came back from the recollection of a conversation that I had had with a person who was a member of a church that had died. I was then a consultant. I no longer do consulting since I'm here at Lifeway, but I was a church consultant, and they really had declined so much that they could not afford to have a consultant come in. But a benefactor said, let's bring Rainer in. I'll pay the consulting fee, he said. And so I came in and I looked at it and stayed with them a couple of weeks. When it was all said and done, I said, unless there's radical transformation, I mean radical and immediate, this church will die in a few years. If I recall correctly, I said 5 or less years, but it lasted longer than that. It held on a little bit longer. But when it died, the person who retained me for the consultation called me up and said, you were right. Now, I took no joy in that, but I was not surprised. And I said, let's walk through it. Let's talk about it. And so we went through all of the issues of how the church died. And when it was said and done, I posted it. And then when I did the book, I did a few more of those interviews, a little over a dozen interviews from church members whose churches had died. And I found the common themes. Not a statistically sound research project, but certainly anecdotally pervasive in the information that I found. And the themes were common throughout there. And so I felt confident writing those themes.
Yeah. Well, you talk about 12 different ways that the church can stay alive in your book, but would you mind highlighting maybe a couple of those, Thom, for us?
Yeah, I divided them into 3 different groups. A church that's showing signs of sickness, a church that's very sick, and a church that is dying. And each of those needs different types of treatment. And I like to make this analogous, Tony, to someone on the outside being a physician and the church being the patient. And basically, you have a church that's showing signs of sickness. What do you do? Basically, you have a church that's very sick. What do you do? And you have a church that may be terminal. Is there anything that you can do? And if it is terminal, what is the best way to offer hospice care, if I may use the metaphor even further? But the big issue on all of these is awareness, just simple awareness, a simplicity that we are having a problem and we have to do something about it. I wrote a post on my blog several months ago. I had gotten so big, so fat. And so I wrote this post about confessions of an obese Christian. There were 2 reasons I did that. One, I thought I'd get some good traffic. So I knew how fat I was, I'd get some good traffic. But the other thing was to face the reality of my obesity. And I was sick. No, I didn't have a terminal illness. No, I didn't have any type of accompanying diseases, but I had the disease of obesity, and I had to do something about it. It was a wake-up call. The second reason I wrote it is so that my readers would make me accountable, and they sure have. And so that was my wake-up call. One of the primary problems, and Tony, I know you see it. You coach, you consult, you write, and I know you see it, is churches are in denial. And the big issue is, how can we get out of denial? Well, just admit that you have a problem. An alcoholic says, I am an alcoholic. An obese person says, I am fat and I need help. A church that is sick needs to say, we are sick. But the reality of it is most churches do not face that truth and they do not confront it head on. Another simple solution, very simple, and you just asked for a couple, we'll stop there. But another very simple solution is move your church looking outwardly. Now, that's a broad statement, very broad, and it could encompass a lot of things. But churches are sicker when they're focused in on themselves, when they are focused on me, myself, and I, and what is the church doing for me, and what does church members want, and what are my preferences being met. If the leadership can begin to move the church toward an outward focus, whether it's community ministry, whether it's some type of traditional outreach program, or whether it's something that is on the cutting edge, something to move them beyond looking at themselves. Those two alone, Tony, I think would be significant.
Thom, the conversation in your book, of course, is about revitalization. And in our current church context, in our church culture today, a lot of conversation about church planting. And I want to hear from you. Do you think the two can coexist, or are they in some ways pulling against each other?
You know, we're basically asking the question, do you want to give birth to a child, or do you want the child to be healthy? And if you ask a parent, do you want to give birth to a child? Are you glad that you gave birth to a child, or do you want the child to be healthy? They'll look at you and kind of tilt their head and say, why is that a question that is in opposition one to another? The reality of it is, we will not need to do revitalization if we're not planting churches. We have to be starting new churches. So that's number one. Number two, we won't have healthy churches to start new churches if we're not doing revitalization. So it is not either or. We need obstetricians and we need internists. We need pediatricians and obstetricians, to keep the metaphor going. It is both, and they complement each other. They're not in competition with each other. They become in competition with each other when we start acting like they're in competition. I rejoice with church plants, and I rejoice with genuine revitalization efforts.
The efforts that you're engaging at Lifeway too, I'm curious to hear how that's complementing some of the themes you wrote about in the book, Thom.
There's several things we're doing and several directions we're going. I will highlight some of them. One is we're putting a lot more emphasis on groups. We are convinced that the data is overwhelming. If you get someone to move from the big event, the worship service, to a group, whether it's a small group, off-campus group, ministry group, Sunday school class, whatever that group may be, if you get them moving in that direction, this is just one of the many stats that you can put out. They're 5 times more likely to be active in the church 5 years later than someone in worship only. So we have been putting a lot of emphasis on good curriculum, not just throwing stuff out there and hope someone will buy it, but really good curriculum in a number of different directions. I could go into those, but basically we've created curriculum that starts from a theological perspective, curriculum that starts from the text, curriculum that starts from life issues, and curriculum that can be designed according to how you want it designed, such as the pastor's sermon. So we have all of those that we've been doing. In my office specifically, now that curriculum is being done by other guys that are a lot smarter than I am, but in my office specifically, I am determined to connect with pastors. Lifeway has done a stinking job of connecting with pastors historically. And so I'm using the advantage of my office and gathering a team together so that we can connect with pastors. And you don't know this, but I'll be calling on you very shortly to see how you, and if you would like to be a part of some of these things that we're doing. So your listeners out there, your viewers can know that I'm coming to see Tony Morgan if he'll let me come see him before even Tony Morgan knew that I was going there.
I'll let you talk to my assistant and see if we can schedule that, Thom.
Yeah, please do. Work me up. Yeah.
Oh, very good. Well, I'm curious too, as you're writing about churches that are in decline and making some changes where revitalization is happening, do you have a story or two of success that you can share?
Yeah, and I wish I remembered the name of the church. We requested stories. In a recent blog post, we said send the stories, and they came in by the volumes. I do know this, that the church is in Maryland, and I do know that the church was started in the 60s. And the church declined to the point that they were about to give up. And they made a decision, we're going to make one last shot at it. And they called a pastor, but they couldn't afford a salary. They said, if we pay this pastor anything close to full time, then we will have to neglect our community if we're really going to reach our community. And so a handful gathered together, and they called this pastor, this young guy fresh out of seminary, and said, will you come at a minimal pay? In other words, will you be bivocational? And he agreed to, because he saw the vision of those few. The vision of those few began to multiply, and the church, first of all, they had a wake-up call. Secondly, they made a decision to look outwardly. And thirdly, they said, we will do this at any cost that God leads us to pay. And the church now has gone from, and don't hold me to the numbers, but it would be somewhere from less than 50 to more than 1,000 right now. They purchased a Kmart, the whole shopping center. And now they have a ministry center in their town. They remodeled it, and they're in the old Kmart. And that was a story of a church demographically that should not have turned around, that historically should not have turned around, that experientially and every other reason should not have turned around, but they dreamed again. And so they had this dream, and God honored it, and they've turned around. That's one of many.
Yeah, that's great. Tom, let me finish with this question. I've had the chance to work with hundreds of churches across the country, and honestly, sometimes the biggest challenge are the smallest churches who want to go to a different place, but they don't want to make any changes to get to that different place. How can we help churches? You began the conversation just kind of admitting this is who we are, this is the challenge we're facing, and then moving beyond that point. How do we help churches get that sense of urgency for change?
Well, some of them will not, and that's the reality of what you're saying. So, some of them will move toward death rather than change. Some people will continue to smoke even though they're being told that eventually you will die, or you could die of that. So the reality of it is many of them will. So if they do not have a wake-up call, it probably will not happen. Now, here's what happens with these small churches, and you're well aware of this. Smaller churches have very intentional relational groups. Sometimes they're families, sometimes they're close friends, sometimes they're people that are near to them. And there's always the fear. It's never explicit, but it's implicit, that if we do some things differently, we're not going to have this group the way it is. So we have somehow got to communicate, if you don't change, you're not going to even have a church the way it is. So my suggestion, let the entire world buy Autopsy of a Deceased Church by Thom Rainer, and that's where you'll see where it's going. No, I'm just joking. I'm joking. But that's why I wrote the book, to say this is the path that you will go. But getting people to break out of those fellowship patterns or family patterns and the relational issues is one of the big challenges in a small church.
Very good. All right. Well, I trust that we can get the book at a Lifeway store, right?
I trust so too, Tony.
So it's Autopsy of a Deceased Church by Thom Rainer. Tom, again, a privilege to connect with you today. And I, too, appreciate what you're doing for the church.
Thank you, Tony. Always appreciate you, and we'll keep following you.